Episode 2, My Thoughts Like Me Recreate Dilemma. Again, I wanted to begin with the precursor of I'm just getting used to these. I really am just doing one take for everything and trying to be as prepared as I can beforehand, but then also very trusting of the energies and thoughts that come to mind when I am speaking them. I try and put some of the more important ideas into notes and posts on Facebook, so there can be ideas put forth. This is very much still a practice for me, and it's risky. It involves a level of bringing a lot of unknown to the table, ideally. I've tried to explain it in some sort of respect, but that's also just to save a little face to the notion of motion involving this risk reward. Ideally, I have a belief that there is a kind of truth in the insight of living the same way I'm doing this podcast. And so it just exited out on me there. Though yes, that was the first little warm up on the piano. I'm gonna get a little more awake to the vibe that this is gonna be going to. To open up, I would like to set out a thought experiment that I will ideally maybe close on, but it ended up really turning into some pretty ideas in regards to the way that uncertainty comes out to define dark matter. And that dark matter may be nothing at all but absence, though it occurs out of a necessary balancing that the universe does due to the fact that some things happen instantaneously due to their immediate macroscopic patterns of evolution that will be carried henceforth no matter what. And that thought experiment is a volcano. As that volcano reaches that tipping point where there's that stability and pressure conflicting each other, and then at once, at an atomic scale, I think you can look at it going to something very small occurring that triggers a causal chain of events that causes the whole eruption. And as soon as that happens, within that atomic action, there is a necessary eruption, and that eruption will be huge in its effect. And due to the geologic patterns found amongst the volcano, there is a pretty definable set range of events that, particularly what I was considering was the web of life that surrounds that volcano. Within a certain radius, it's gonna see the light coming, and it's gonna hear the sounds, and those play out intermediately in between this instantaneous little blip within the volcano and then its eventual demise. And so the fact that there's this instantaneous fate created out of that tipping point, and then there's this carrying out of that instantaneous fate, particularly, I think, shows something traveling faster than the speed of light, because that life is going to understand that it's dying, and it's going to get signals about it via the light and the sound that it could ever see. And upon the realistic events of that volcano, there is still much that is occurring that is uncertain in how those interactions carry out. The array of atoms that exist in any structure, any existing object, interacts with the world around it on a quantum level because of the fact that the particles involved are small enough to be influenced by things such as light and the waves that they emit on the scale of their energy and their mass. Particularly, the mass is what determines the wavelength that those particles fundamentally carry amongst the world. There is those quantum decisions that are occurring that I think are always aligning to come to create a balanced order in the world, and that upon those instantaneous possibly particles, and one thing that is sort of interesting will be to consider something such as like a negative time scale, and particularly just something more interesting that I felt came kind of out of an insight and was able to discuss with my dad about, particularly because I was actually trying to explain one of my nightly eruptions that happened, and I put it into a metaphor of a volcano, and I was writing out a poem to him, and just sort of really started to evolve from this, and that potential. And I've been thinking with intellectuals on, frankly, already this podcast, so it's a little bit interesting and very crucial that I am following suit on just doing the one take, I think, because there are lines across time that were popping up upon the fact that I have had this idea and was going to be sharing it, and that the fact that the dark matter may be just an absence was an opinion that I heard out of that. Initially, what I was thinking might be quite possible is that the speed of light, where we think about it becoming from relativity, the equations tell us as we speed a massive object up to the speed of light, it gains an infinite mass. And I've had some insight to question that we could still be describing our world accurately and say that there's just one speed of light, when in reality what we're seeing is a expression of multiple speeds of light. And particularly, quite interestingly, there is a kind of light road idea that came out of that if we were to travel across galaxies, there would be a set path that we would want to take because of the effects of our position relative to that speed of light. And to get into any geometric unity is maybe worth a little bit of time, but one of the real kind of like crucial elements that I see in it is that there's sort of this invisible field and there's the field that we work amongst, and the field that I'm describing as invisible is more of the forces and how this underlying map of action directions occur. And then there are what are the players, and those players are influencing the way that those action directions are describing things. And to think of some other like similar potential insights within string theory and like a multiverse, that there's many different multiverses or many different universes, and quite a little swinging around the potentials of where we're getting these ideas is a little bit more on the side of what I'm kind of maybe getting to, because I think it does tie into some of the dilemmas that we face and the ways that living with a high moral, and that's what I've described as a coded stability in your expectations that define the way that we interact with others, that those insights carry easier when there is a greater inertial ego present in somebody. As an aside, but that there are different present forces in physics in other universes, getting to the simple of it. And the way that those underlying fields are changing with what's going on, and that the speed of light may be different in other places, is pretty critical in thinking about an equation that would describe where that speed of light falls, and what would maybe be a more complex equation that would define what would be happening as we approach the speed of light. Because what I have a feeling actually for is, as we approach the speed of light, similar to like a Pauli exclusion principle, that no set particle of the universe in which we live can occupy the same quantum state as another. That's where we get things such as fusion, when there's a great compression and not an available amount of space. It's greater than dense. To go greater than fast is to actually more or less be a type of compression, but rather than something becoming supermassive, it becomes an inverse mass. It becomes a dark matter. And it relates potentially to something that is, and I've said timeless, but I think actually a negative time. Because I think if we were to map out the whole universe across some set total of something that is what we would call stable, or something that we would say is infinitely unstable, or I don't know what the other side of the speed of light would look like, but to think that you could draw a graph of everything and have the speed of light in its position per what area of the universe it was in, as it would approach the speed of light and turn into an inverse mass steadily, and out of its playing out across time, it creates the necessary balance of maybe the energy that would need to go into accelerating something to the speed of mass, speed of light. And critically, it still goes back to this idea of the volcano, because I feel like all the information in that thought experiment still needs to be conserved. And in the way that magma is flowing, again, there's these playing outs of quantum states that are generally said as said, but to go to actually another insight that I've had and shared with people, so it's out there, that we get natural disasters when there are major disruptions in our state of unity. And to think that it is possibly related to karma, or the fact that our consciousnesses can become so wrought with dilemma that then there are these natural disasters that carry great amounts of uncertainty to suit out the consciousnesses that are calling on actions of necessary counteraction. And the counteraction right there is a new thought. And I think maybe goes to point maybe that this balancing of everything being tied within that negativity and the instantaneous fate of that event, there may be something there. And one of the other interesting side theorems of that all together is within a causal chain. If something isn't moving and something is totally stable and is reliant on something of a very low probability, looking at like that similar uncertain like level of probability, when it is not moving, is it eliminated from any causal chain? And just to think of a rock that's present in that volcano, it is holding some place of space that explains that space, but to think about its magnitudinal impact in a maybe different dimensional form where like velocity comes into play, and to think of dimensions like beyond just distance over time, but other qualities over time as well, within the causality of the physics that we're describing, it's describing. There is something cool about the way that it hopefully kind of maybe brings to light this uncertainty of physics, where we use classical mechanics to describe large objects moving amongst there, but they don't really have any bounds to what's happening on the small scale. And generally in other areas of science that have those different regions of action, there's something more metaphysically philosophical that's tied up in the fact that our consciousness will never certainly be able to describe anything. As for that being just the intro to that thought experiment, it ended up being what has flowed out more as a whole chapter. Next chapter I'd like to carry off some of that idea of what is the shared instance across that event and other events, and try and get into some explanation of how this uncertainty, consequent dark energy, negatively positioned and necessary balanced energy relates to healing, and how people can share those strong moments in a place that is existing for all time, but only within that negatively allowed space, because otherwise it wouldn't exist. And the way all those can possibly line up within the intelligence that we're all sort of agreeing is on time is something that just takes the necessary practice and iterative trusting with those that maybe it could ever mean to. So the idea of having so many different healing instances and shared strength moments with people that need them is something that's always growing, and it exists, I think, possibly infinitely described within the cells, and infinitely within there's the possibility of there being as many different growth patterns as possible, but depending on how spread out across the shared mean of those structurings, the fact that it can exist at any time carries this consequent teaching of a fact that we all are met with a great deal of time and space all at once in the structuring of what goes on to describe a kind of hypergenetics of who we allow to exist based on our macroscopic decisions. Though the fact that all of this karmic and atimal information is being created and determining fate upon those really steady set expectations is possibly the most important in considering that accidents or events that come to challenge a strength of those structures exist, and that they should be destroyed when they are, but there is a fluctuating level of in-touchness with the world that also, I guess, should be really considered non-negatable, and meaning that it's factual. It can't be reduced to nothing, but in the fact that no person can ever predict all the uncertain things in the future, there's just basically kind of the nature and nurture conversational element that it's sort of this percentage of one and the other that we can't totally decide, this set and born path that can be carried out, and this uncertainty that exists more amongst the fluctuations that you come to live by. And the real possibility of plasma coming out of that idea of the volcano, and that in those really hot and just ridiculously like destructive conditional areas of the world and universe, and how much we're related to things far away versus really what is just right here, and what we can agree on conversationally to perform the similarly patterned pathways, thoughts, structures, when there is those paralleled and always at different times, they're never not going to exist, is when there is a just sort of sign that one is in touch with the flow of everything around it, and stuff that is more or less meaningful. But the uncertainty and the dark energy and what is potentiated in those swirls of nothingness, if it exists in a superposition, you know, it's in kind of nothing, there is a higher percentage of it being governed by quantum interactions. And so if there's any ability to create the hyperstates of uncertainty amongst more quantumly enabled substances, there is a greater ability for there to be a presence of what would, I think, definitively be a portal to something on a different area of time. Because going to what is sort of this hypothesis that dark energy and uncertainty are very related, dilemma being, and simple dilemma, maybe, amongst the fact that there can be one way or the other, and those then growing in size differences, creating a space for there to be what carries information more for a physical area in another area of space, is where I think cells with their plasma structures and environments in the bloodstreams, lymphatic systems, I don't know if they're entirely plasma, but the fact that they're small molecules amongst the body and in fluids and closer to a particle, there is still quantum interactions occurring with those size of objects. That the creation of these dark energy portals and conversations of which can be taking away energy from another area in time and space. And consciously, when it's something that is going to lead to like your greater structuring too, I think, to think of the areas of your expertise leading to exactly what ends up finding them, especially with a kind of more hand-wavy idea. It's still so an earlier thought in terms of seeing this happen in my own life, that the future was guiding me just to it. And in my appreciation and, again, stability in what one could expect that appreciation to look like. There's an allowed kind of impact that starts to be felt by the future. And one sort of interesting furthering of that idea of finding somebody that starts making a ruckus in your own system and noticing that some of your energy should be attentioning to it, and for your own then appreciated important structuring, the possibility of this House of Cards example is really kind of a favorite for me because of what I've found working out and running into sensations of other sort of existing patterns, and particularly it came from posting a video of me staring at the sun. And to the day last year on 4th of July, I had a pretty magnificent day of visions, and compiled or in shared motion with others, the fact that it's a very collectively positive just enjoyment of a summer day that brought it. I'm not totally sure, but I was posting a few things on Facebook. I had a Twitter going as well, and some voice came through to me in my conversation and told me, I bet you can look in the sun. And to its paranormal definition and decoded ciphering, who knows exactly where it was coming from. But long story short, I felt very filled with a great positive light, and I haven't totally gotten to any explanation for myself as to how it would relate to Dharma or this dilemma that now I'm seeking into. But I did, and it was partly because I was working a double that day. I had a house cleaning shift in the morning, and then I went to my delivery job for the evening shift. And so I was working hard and was also just trying to function at like a really high spiritual level, and for just all the time I could. So I was at a high spiritual state, and I did, and I was able to bring about an energy within me, and the fact that there was the dark energy being created amongst my own empowerment. It's possible that I was very much feeling all in one motion, the same way that going through a strait of very direness, to think just a specific, going through a small hallway, and that I was walking on a very narrow path. Maybe it goes to the fact that the dilemma I was carrying was all very much in a parallel operation, that I was able to act more with a full-bodied emotional energy, because sometimes it's more difficult. But what I've found actually in having shared that you can look in the sun, that other people then sort of go and try it, and I've seen that like a matching of energies creates an ability for that to occur. And one of the real interesting phenomenon of having posted that was then seeing that I was responsible for some burned retinas. And the fact that those burned retinas, those uncertain callings for my own dark healing energy to meet theirs in a time when maybe those retinal cells were, I don't know, decoding, comes to mind to explain the fact that they were being eliminated, and that I was able to take away some of that energy that was erupting, and that it came at times that were almost opportune for me, was the surprising part. It was like, oh, there's another like blank like vision that I'm having, like I can't see like right ahead right now. And the possibility of those meeting and those kind of retinal cells existing as one fluctuating quantum conversational object, and it existing to support the other, is maybe just as I started off, it's for further sort of interesting societal experimentation to know how that house of cardsing is something real, and where those opposing pressures, where two retinal cells are more in a shared meaningful bonding, that creates the dark energy necessary there, because maybe it is out of the bonding that all the parallel sort of alignment that occurs in the necessary bonding to achieve that puts the problem pain in a place that can receive those necessary energy takeaways and be used elsewhere. And as for how it becomes a superpower, there is the simple idea of what you can do when something that was doing doesn't need to do. And it's, I think, quite interesting to just do for fun. And like I said, it can be done holding your breath. It can be done in exercise, and is a necessary kind of power when you need it. And how important karmically, uncertainly, somebody else is difficult to say that can be played with. And the consequences of such ideally play out the same way as you decide in a world that we're more familiar. I think it's still a very common mental embodiment that we're familiar with applying a construct of thought to, which is good. final chapter of this episode, I would like to throw a few thoughts to the idea of rich and poor, nesses and elements of dilemma. And I added the N in the title just because I kind of use it in an indication that it needs to be met with another N for it to be a full M. I haven't really totally mentioned that, though dilemma can be entirely personal, or I think it can be entirely relational. And I think that does go to describe some level of wealth found in each dilemma, and whether that's something that is relatable, being a primary indicator of that empowering quality to that dilemma. And frankly, I haven't totally gotten a great idea of how to describe this richness or closer to compiled elements of the ness of the dilemma. But overall, there is a relation to maybe the dilemmas that you carry with you, and indicative, relatable, those two words being what makes that personal dilemma a full-on shared dilemma, because then it's something that is there with you later on and is something that you decisively learned and ironed to a smooth and then again coherently intelligent processing dichotomy, wherever that maybe intelligence rests. I remember more when I was younger thinking of playing the piano at times very much a hand intelligence, and that my hands held the brain in what they were doing. As for why that idea isn't so important to think of, I'm not sure. Though maybe it goes to the fact that I don't really have any reason to put what became a question of some sort of money when I was writing out some of these notes, that there is a further energy, conservation that is quite important, but then also not talked about, like, just in terms of the fact that these dilemmas are impactful and verifiable out of their further seen establishment. And one of the real rich elements of a dilemma, I think, goes to the fact that it poses a lot of different options and creates a refinement of other dilemmas, and plays to maybe a more observable, descriptive beauty that isn't the same as when they're a little bit more sparsely placed. To think of notes in a melody, if you played one note and then waited a little bit longer and played another, it's possible there's a lot of dilemma stored amongst those two notes. And having listened to a little bit of my speaking here, I speak a little bit in this distant stutter, I've wondered how much I'm operating upon an egoic karma to place the ideas that I am pulling out of my I-hat. Particularly to a conversation of a lot of different tones. And the way tone and hellos, greetings, have played into a question of something I mentioned earlier about how there is the written of concepts and constructs over our genetics. Same way these dilemmas are playing out of their organizational survival. That is kind of related to the fact that the tonalities and limited choices that we bring to a pertaining influence to our interactions and potential dealings of a very densely put dilemma is more to be thought on, because how much to be said within one's balanced and then unbalanced awareness can all be piled on top of each other. There's a lot of, I think, skill building that can work within the variability of that. It's just maybe something to take away, how much you can think about all the different options that your body is considering. And if it's a problem, it's probably a poor dilemma. And what I want to say with that is that I see a problem as like a wall where there's these other dilemmas that should be dealt with first. And also that this is showing me that a poorness is related to the present, and that when you were to describe a dilemma poor, it is a little bit more to the fact that present is the most valuable moment that we can ever consider, the priciest of our decisions. And the benefits for many upon these dilemmas are what are shared dilemmas relatively correspond in a maybe exciting way. I feel like I'm being thrown the motorcycle video that I'm gonna be recording this next couple week, because maybe up until the 15th that I actually find the area I'm gonna be riding out to California, and I've thought maybe a ride around Lake Tahoe or just a different road actually that I've driven in the Sierras that's really nice, and that sort of takes away from the fact that maybe I was speaking on some excitement there that I find. But one of the big tricks that I am kind of, I see generally moving amongst is this relation of the all-timal kind of sparsing of different segments of different information, but still corresponding in harmonic energies, and essentially slowly proving to myself that the carryings of these conversational dark energy portaled uncertainty driven nothings really can play out like a conversation across time. And the way that we process these different segments is based out of the fact that the shifting colors of their fluctuations can be spoke upon the same way that our voices do. Wanting to bring in the fact that was very closely tuned to the idea of that our structures are all changing at once with each other, because they can be parallel, those sparse segments, and not be now. And that is really kind of quite interesting, because it still has to be those impactful and verifiably, I guess, valued in the description that they write in who we are, to still be present. And I think that's pretty cool, because in the hope of some sort of adjusting to a primary time zone and intelligence of our emotions, the closer we are in terms of shared dilemma, the easier we all move forward upon a common basis of what I've wanted to describe as our moral set, the spiritual principles that we carry with us, that we can be confident in conversing with others at any moment and any perspective, that there is the common denominator of how we exist. And with competition being something quite interesting, with a desire to explain most of our actions as drives to encounter dilemma and to play games with the operations of iterative, again, timely and time again, existences that are what keep us in shared ideologies, and generally where we find fun in the ideas of our comedies, resting out to understand the deeper lessons of our encountered advancements, challenges, and apostrophe on the advancements, that our advancements hold their issues. Yeah, I mean, of course challenges hold issues, but the important element of good competition to me is shared learning. And the biggest question that, wrapping this all up and getting to a less sinned state myself, as this is the end of the podcast, the question I'd like to leave is, wow, in terms of like the voices that I'm speaking out and the energies that hopefully aren't related to the fact that this seems to be dragging on and that there's something holding you. The question being potentially maybe the driving force of why I'm having trouble saying it and I'm experiencing the challenging emotions that I have is, where does the struggles of others and their dilemmas intersect with the reasons why we want to solve them? Because with that becoming a bigger lens, there's not only a lot more magic, but also it's how we're going to realize that the greater chaos that we put the world in, the harder it is going to be to solve the dilemmas that separate us.